Hello, and welcome to the Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast, a podcast that serves to educate and empower while we explore the intersections of social justice, economic empowerment, and holistic well-being within communities of color. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I invite you to join me as we dive deep into the crucial topics that shape our lives, challenge the status quo, and strive for a more equitable future for all. Hello, and welcome to Race, Wealth, and Health Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Joycelyn Morris, and I am incredibly excited to be joined by not one, but two guests today. So excited to have the mother and son duo of Miss Adrienne Dumpson Diggs and Dennis Maurice Dumpson. They are a mother-son duo leveraging their experience and expertise as race, equity, and inclusion leaders and nonprofit executives to support the humane growth and learning of service sector and care economy. So, Adrienne and Dennis, welcome.
Thank you.
So much for having us.
So this is actually my first time meeting Ms. Adrienne, but Dennis and I met at the back in September at the EDLOC conference. EDLOC stands for Educational Leaders of Color, and it was my first conference. I can't remember. I don't think it was yours, or is it? So I just joined EDLOC and was really excited to be amongst other educational leaders of color. Like, it was really just a beautiful space, a beautiful convening. We collectively watched one of the debates together. It was just a really great time. And so naturally, Dennis and all of his amazing splendor when it comes to fashion caught my attention. And so we ended up chatting it up at the conference and just kind of kept in touch. And I was like, I would absolutely love to have you on the podcast. So I'm so glad that we were able to make this happen.
Yeah, my fashion is the big draw. A career doesn't even matter. You come in with the looks.
Exactly. And then talking to Dennis, he was telling me
5.
about his mom. So really excited to meet you. Why don't you both just kind of start with telling our listeners a little bit about yourself? So I'll actually start with you, Ms. Adrienne.
Okay, well, I come with about 25 years of experience managing teams in the nonprofit world. Part of that has drew me into human resources and equitable practices within the organization. And the biggest part of my leadership skills is just really lending an opportunity to be transparent in the workplace and having time for those equitable practices to not only extend from myself, that other people feel that they're part of the whole puzzle of dealing in human services.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
That's in a nutshell.
Yeah, so I am following my mom's footsteps in the sense that I've been in nonprofit for my entire career, largely in educational nonprofits. My background is more so in the administrative side, fundraising, strategy, and communications work, but I'm also an educator. I developed a course with LaSalle University's nonprofit center called Abolition, Reform, and Expansion of Philanthropy. So I really try to bring thoughtfulness around the ways that we engage around nonprofit education and learning. And that's also done through my business, which is Invest Black, #InvestBlack, which is a racial equity firm that focuses on vitiating anti-Blackness and the policies, practices, and procedures of nonprofit and educational organizations. And that work is just an amalgamation of everything, because while I've been mostly a fundraiser and kind of on the back end and not as a program or administration person, like directly working with people, a lot of my view kind of informs how we can be able to change our practices to make sure, to my mom's point, make sure those equitable practices are enveloped inside of the way that we build organizations. So that's my career.
Awesome. And so how does one get into said career? Like, tell me a little bit about your original journey. Like, when you guys were in college, like, is this what both of you knew you wanted to do, or did you take some major pivots and turns as it relates to your career?
Well, I'll start just because it is a good lead into my mom being able to add value to this question. I learned through my first teachers are my mom, my grandmom, my family. And because of that, my mom, she started a nonprofit in 1991. It was to be able to support parents being able to develop resources and support systems so that they can be able to support their children and families too, have better access to resources in the human services field. And like having that be, and that was in the basement of our church. So having that be like the initial part of like how you grow up, it was almost like, I don't even think I ever looked at corporate careers. I don't think I ever looked at like when I was first coming out of college. I think everything was about how do I had interest in things that were not necessarily service sector related, but I had interest in that. And from the point of fundraising, like there was no degree for fundraising. There was no study or scholarship or whatever in the undergraduate space for it. So I jumped in just going into the work. You know what I mean? A lot of this has just been, I think what a lot of people in the nonprofit education sectors, outside of teachers who most certainly train for the work, a lot of us come into it with like the heart for the work and then have to kind of build up a practice in the midst of it too. So that's kind of my journey.
Awesome. Dennis,
Yeah.
but prior to you launching that nonprofit in 91, how did you start?
Actually, that was the start. That was the start. Well, let me even go back further because it is beyond that. My mother, was a manager for the mayor's office. And from the time I was a child, probably like 8 or 9 years old, that was our summer to distribute foods. I was 9 years old calling out people's name. Miss Jones, you next, in the office. So that introduction to service and the nonprofit industry came very early. My mother ran soup kitchens and clothing drives and things like that. So all those things start to become ingrained in you. And did I know I was going to fall into social services? It fell onto me. You know what I mean? So it wasn't like a path that I even had to think about. It was just a part of who I was. My mother was held at such high esteem, you wanted to be just like her and do the things that she was doing because it represented so much good. So in 90, I was a young mother and we were living on our own, Dennis and and I started off putting sticky notes. I don't know if you remember that. And so my friends would come over. I would, say, hey, these are resources, get yourself a job. It's like anything you can think of. And so eventually when our pastor at the time, I believe it was Reverend Steffens, I said, come on down here in the basement and you can have your meetings here. And so I formed the Parent Support Center. And we did that for a long time. I eventually reached out to a nonprofit looking for some parenting services for myself. And as I was talking to the manager that came to my home, he said, you know what, you don't need any of this. He said, I need you to come work for us. And I started work at a local nonprofit as a family advocate and a parent educator. And so that began my career with women who were like myself. It was a peer mentored program. So from relatable experiences, having been a young mother and right there with them through the trenches, speaking from that peer experience, moved into another phase of that where I worked for an agency that provided teen parent education and employment services. That just started to evolve. From there, went on to child subsidized services where my leadership skills kind of took off from that point. And that just kind of got the ball rolling into seeing how organizations, the in-depth from one side to the other. So I had a full scope from ground up.
No, that's awesome. What was your aha moment or moments like where you were like, yeah, this is what I'm supposed to be doing, right? Like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. And that you knew that you were, clear that you were on the right path in terms of your professional journey.
I don't know for myself when that aha moment actually occurred, but I would say throughout the career, and I would run into women who are now women now, these young girls at the time, and there's like, I'm a nurse, Miss Adrienne, or I'm a social worker. And I was just like, oh, wow, getting those kudos and running into people because I stayed in the industries. I can remember going to a conference and I ran into one of my students at the time, and she was running one of the largest daycares. That it was just like, I was like, wow, I was like, I'm so proud of you. And she just hugged me like so tightly. That was really, I would say, if that had to be an aha moment, that would be one that I would pick, because it was just like, oh, talk about connect the dots, you know?
Yeah, I think because my work has been in fundraising, it's been around what my work has been able to develop and like what the sustainability has been. I worked with a CDFI convener. CDFIs are community development financial institutions, and I led their fundraising for a period of time, and that sprouted off to being able to get a $22 million investment that supported small business owners in 13 states across the country. That was something where it was like, oh, wow, like this isn't just raising money for the sake of raising money. It actually has definitive impact. And then even work that I did while I was at a charter network of getting funding to be able to build a school that still exists today that supports more than 1,000 predominantly African American students in North Philadelphia, are parts where I'm kind of like, oh, this is a signature part of the work. And that's like in the nonprofit space. From the point of Invest Black, like I've done things in the last 5 years since starting this, built the first Black Studies curriculum or Black History curriculum for the same charter network that I'm referring to as a consultant, developing like citywide initiatives for one of our biggest historic moments in the country, which will come up in 2026, developing their DEI practices, working with one of the top 5 largest museums in the country to build their equity practices, the Philadelphia Museum of Art in particular. So I just think all of those things have been things where I'm like, oh, my work is actually working. It's not just a thing. But I think this new generation of radical sensitivity is the thing that I'm becoming the most proud of, this idea, especially being able to do it with my mom, because I think it takes the best of what our experiences have been. And an aha moment that kind of tells me that that is the truth is I always say this to my mom. During the pandemic, we had a big crisis of things in our family. And I forgot what the issue was or whatever, but I said something to my mom and said, like, no, like we can't do that or we don't do this. And she said, well, I don't know, Dennis. I am a human or something to that end, like that, or I'm a person. And I was like, no, you're not. You're my mom. And it is that like idea that's kind of like been the germ of an experience where I said, oh my God, I'm 36 years old and I just realized that my mother is a human and a person. And if I can have that awareness with somebody that I'm most closely tied to, surely that can happen inside of the workplace. Surely that's happening inside of throughout the sector. So I think even now I'm learning how much I don't know. And that's a sign of me still being able to have more race to run. You know what I mean? So that's also a good part of my aha moments in learning.
Absolutely. So tell me, what is sort of this idea of radical sensitivity? How would each of you define it? And I'm start with you, Ms. Adrienne.
So I would define radical sensitivity as the first approach towards empathy in any situation, but in this context, in the workplace. It's a concept that shouldn't be foreign. It shouldn't be foreign, because those sensitivities should just come. It goes back to that old adage, you treat people as you want to be treated, but everybody doesn't want to be treated in the way you may think. So, and that's the bigger portion of that, is that how we frame the day to day and how leadership shows up in these spaces is so important. Part of my background is in trauma informed care, and being a trauma informed professional, it tells us some things about how we react, how to pick up to some of those things that show up or for people from their past. I like to look at a different way of conceptualizing that in a human centered workplace. Yeah, we're all humans, but something that is rooted, a human centered / rooted workplace shows that the roots are not just something we just cover up, but those roots stem from something even greater, and how we treat one another. Each plant is different. And so we have to look at that in the way of people, that we don't make those approaches to radicalizing the workplace, being disingenuous and saying, oh yeah, you be kind to everyone. Not just about being kindness, but having a strength of understanding, the true empathy of where people are, meeting folks where they are, not just talking about it, but really making the organization bleed that. This is a part of the day-to-day fiber of treating folks with not only understanding, but with respect in the workplace.
Yeah, I think the point my mom just touched on too about it not being about kindness, I think that is like really key, because there's a way that we start to think when we hear something like sensitivity, we start thinking about, oh, we should be sensitive to everybody, and we should be, the kindness is where it all starts. Surely kindness is a part of this. Surely us being sensible about how we engage with people is signature to this, but it isn't the actual thing. I would even frame like this idea of radical sensitivity. How many times have you been in an office place or any place and you just kind of like, I know somebody else has to see this, not just me, right? And you're experiencing that thing. You're like, I know I'm not the only one that's seeing this thing happen. Or I know I'm not the only person that's experiencing this thing. And then you may make cut eyes with somebody and say, like, okay, somebody else sees it, or that type of thing. That is the space that radical sensitivity lives in. It is an awareness that the things that we feel we are experiencing are not just us, that they are things that are happening. I think radical sensitivity is calling us to think about how we can honor the things that are happening inside of workplaces. And then from a more systemic level, we then start to be able to say, when we start seeing breakdowns in communication, when we start seeing low parts of retention inside of the workplace, when we start to see high levels of burnout and exhaustion among employees or whatever, we're learning something. So radical sensitivity actually is a call to action. It's a verb. And it's saying, act like you know. You know what I mean? Which is something my mom and my grandma would say to me all the time. Like, act like you know, act like you know what's happening, act like you can see what's going on. So this is calling us to act like we know something is happening. You know what I mean? And not avoiding it. So it's really calling us in to be diligent in thinking about what our response to sometimes inhumane environments should be and could be.
And having a proactive versus reactive environment is part of that as well.
Mm-hmm. And I think I had two questions. I'll start with the first one. When you first kind of mentioned Dennis, radical sensitivity, you used the example of, during COVID and chatting with your mom and like, oh, if I didn't realize, if I didn't see her in her humanity, what does that mean? And tell me, how do you foresee that in terms of how that plays out in the workplace when you think about the implementation of radical sensitivity?
Yeah. So it's been I think I must mention it at least once a month. I'm like, remember when I didn't see you as a human mom? Because it was just shocking to me, because of course I love my mother and we have a really close relationship. And what the awareness was for me was that if I cannot see her fully and I'm with her all the time and we're in this way, I know I'm not seeing everything else fully. There has to be a breakdown in the way that I'm seeing the rest of the world. And if that is happening to me, I know it has to be happening in other places. So, like, even when we start thinking about the book and we start thinking about some of the other things that we're developing around this, it's all in honor of responding to this idea that it is actually a humane understanding that sometimes we do not see people for who they truly are. And that's brokered by a lot of the ways that we're indoctrinated into work culture, into labor, in ways that it's about process and getting things done and this and that. And we forget that people are humans that are producing these things. And I think the reason why my mom and I are kind of like, we don't want this to be about like kindness solely, because this is also about, you could be efficient, you can have good work ethic, and you also can be humane at the same time. And what oftentimes happens is that we conflate value and utility. And what I learned from my personal experience with my mom is that there was a way that I was utilizing her identity in my life and I wasn't valuing it. So then what that means is that if I'm doing that personally, there's plenty of times I'm going to do that in work where I utilize people to be able to get a job done, to be efficient, to get these things done, but I don't value them. And that's something that we have to really be honest with ourselves about, be authentic in our responsiveness to this. And to my mom's point about proactivity, be proactive in finding systems, developing systems, policies, and practices that allow us to get out of it. Like, don't stay there. You know what I mean? Move on. So I think that that's where that personal experience kind of weaves into how I think this can help out the sector, particularly social service sectors, helping professions in the care economy.
Yeah. And Miss Adrienne, so while Dennis sort of shared what his introduction was of thinking about this topic in terms of radical sensitivity. What was the same moment, the same lever for you, or was there something else that kind of triggered for you when you really started thinking about, and what, even if you didn't maybe have the verbiage, right, of radical sensitivity, but really started thinking about what the practice itself meant and what was missing?
I think it started, well, I don't think it started when I had my own experience within a toxic workplace and how that affected and manifested in me. And there was clearly a lack of empathy on that side, but there was still a side of me where I had to evoke I put someone else's needs above mine, and led to me becoming unsafe, you know.
Mm.
Within that experience, I would also often share with my husband and Dennis and just really talk about the experiences that I was feeling. And I just kept saying to Dennis, I said, I don't want anyone to have had this experience and not know how to find their way out. And so we started talking. He was like, Mom, you're talking about something, it's just it's not a radical thing, but there are sensitivities to what you're saying. And so it started to come about, and we started to flush out what that actually meant. I just kept saying, I said, I just don't want anyone to have undergone anything that I went through. And I just was kind of locked in that. So having the framework around radical sensitivity, because I did find my way out, obviously, but there was a push and pull, because all I was focused on was that one piece. I don't want anyone to experience this, but I wasn't looking at it in a grander scope of there are steps. What were the steps that led me to get out of that? What were the push and pulls that changed that to make radical sensitivity and breathe life into it? And that came about really from Dennis sort of pushing that there's more to it. You're not thinking about the things that led you to come out of that. Yes, you want to help people and you will help people, but I just wasn't thinking about it in the full scope. So getting back to how it came about, it really came about was a process. But that process for me really started with coming out of my own trauma from the situation and forgiving myself for not protecting myself, which was huge for me, was really huge. And I think in part when I talked about the human-centered and a rooted workplace, it's about meeting folks where they are, and everybody's going to be in a different path. But that's a part of the radical sensitivity of it all, is to see folks, see people as individuals. And we can have teams, we can have groups, but in those groups are individuals. And so that's where the radical sensitivity part of it comes, is to be sensitive and not desensitized to the issues that creep up in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just
Yes,
tether
please
to
do.
that too? So one of the things that she brought up was the idea of her being unsafe. And we both have had like traumatic experiences in the workplace, which is also a birthing of this too. We are not exempt, but we
Me
also.
too, right?
Are you
I
still?
think a
Wait
lot
a
of
minute.
people who
Wait a
look
minute.
like us have had at least
It's not
one.
just us.
At least one. I think most people of color have had at least one traumatic.
No, and after experiencing those things, one of the things that I recognized was that we both were in leadership positions. We weren't junior employees. So what that also expresses too, because we're talking to the service sector, but we're also talking to leaders, because there are ways that we get disempowered. And sometimes our disempowerment has more effects. So even when my mom is mentioning, I became unsafe, it's not because I'm intending to hurt someone. It's because I now have to find a way to get through this. So I'm not able to support and protect and provide a sensitive, aware culture to the people that are on my team. And my mom in particular, she's managed teams as large as more than teams and not much big teams. I know that it also becomes a thing when you talk about forgiveness of oneself. it is also that question of how am I going to be an effective leader if I am not able to effectively be able to protect myself? You know what I mean? And then that makes the environment unsafe under my watch, which then means that we actually need sensitivity, not just for people who are experiencing it at a ground level in an organization, but at all levels. Everybody actually needs that level of support too.
Yeah. You hit on a lot of different things, and I'm like, so many questions I can ask, but I'm trying to stick to the format that I have. But I guess one thing I will click on is what you talked about around being safe, and how that shows up when you don't have that safety, and also just the experience of having to, as I think you mentioned, say, forgive oneself for maybe not knowing. And what I think maybe I heard, well, I don't know, I don't want to assume actually. So tell me, when you say forgiving oneself, like, what are the things that we're talking about when it comes to, or the experiences that you felt like you had before you maybe knew or could put words to what was happening to you?
Yeah, I think that I felt when my son would always say, Mom, what's happening? I was like, I'm not safe. I don't feel safe. It was just a feeling of nobody was chasing me, but it was very guttural. You know what I mean? Friday night, I'm already on Monday morning. So that's not a feeling of safety. And I was more focused on protecting my teams or individuals who could easily be in the same boat that I was, that I wasn't protecting myself because I was placing that empathy everywhere except for this vessel. And that became the biggest challenge, that I had to forgive myself because I did not protect myself. I didn't feel like I had any other voice that could identify with me, because in those type of settings, people are like, better you than me, sister. I'm sorry for you. I saw it, but I'm not saying nothing either. In those moments where you feel you're most unsafe, that you can't call on anyone. So the most I could call is my husband, is my son, and to say, help me. I'm already in a tizzy about Monday, or I have a meeting coming up. I'm feeling unsure, all those types of things. And I just had to forgive myself. I was not giving myself any grace, because I felt like I had to be the Florence Nightingale of it all and protect my teams.
Right.
It had a team of 80 plus employees, and that's the only mode that I was in. Back to, I don't want anyone to feel what I am feeling. But I had no one to put that on or to help me through that process besides my family.
Yeah.
So when other leaders, because again, I was a director, I wasn't our entry level teams or anything like that. And there was no place for me to go. So you can't rely on anyone else, because you have to be able to tie that up for yourself. And I just always felt like if there was that instruction, if there was that radical sensitivity that could be shared throughout leadership, because when there's a big dog in the room, everybody's watching out for themselves. They're not looking to pull others out because you don't want to get bitten either. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah. No, it doesn't. And I actually did have a follow-up. So when you talk about, wanting to protect your team, and I think you use the example of like, it would be a Friday and you were already on Monday's work. Where was that maybe pressure or stress coming from to be what I think I'm hearing, which is kind of overextending yourself and sort of pushing towards the next thing? What were those external pressures, i.e. from leadership, or was any of that internal?
There may have been a combination of both my own internal pressures, but when I'm saying that I was already on Friday, I was on Monday, it was really about just the anticipation of not knowing what I was going to face from that leader. So, I said leader, but the word was actually boss. So I'm always the one saying, don't call me a boss. I'm a leader. So that's what I mean when I say that. I just didn't know from maybe this Monday would have been a great week. But at any given time, it could change. And it could change to be where it's like, I would say, well, what did I do? What
And what
happened?
I wanted to call that out, right? Because I feel
Yeah.
like we were talking around it a little bit, and I want to call it out because I want to make sure that we're identifying these behaviors so that people can identify whether or not they're experiencing some of these same behaviors, right? And so what I think I'm hearing you say is like, this leader was uh, particularly volatile and not necessarily consistent. Like you never knew what you were going to get, and everything was constantly changing, whether that was like interpersonally. And I'm describing individuals I've experienced as
No, you're
well,
spot
right?
on.
Like you never knew what you were going to come back to and what kind of requests you were going to have, and everything just felt chaotic. Am I sort of describing that?
Oh yeah. It was certainly a dog eat dog environment, and just depending on what the need was, that could have been a good week because there's just no rhyme or reason to it. And I don't know, Denny, if you can recall any. I'm sure you recall plenty. And I felt that guilt also because I felt like I was dumping on them. I said, well, I'm not going to tell, my husband anymore. I said, because I think he's just as mad as I am when he sees these people. I said,
I think one of the things, I'm sorry, I think like one of the things that I remember distinctly too is my mom has had a very successful career as a leader. And prior to this particular thing, she was managing a particular office that just had stellar outcomes, like teams that were highly engaged, like if they were giving out awards, it would be award winning. It was an exemplar. And that's what elevated her to be in this position. So I think the big thing about what I recognized her having to forgive herself for was having been on this upwardly mobile trajectory, feeling very proud of the career that you've built, and then to come into this thing and kind of be like squashed, and then trying to figure out how do you stay driven, you know what I mean? So to an extent or whatever, like I think that was something that I recognized too. So I think the forgiveness wasn't just about the experience, but it's about how much momentum you've built that you feel going between your fingers. You know what I mean? I feel like that's a part of the kind of the pain of these experiences too.
Yeah, no, definitely. And so tell us a little bit more about radical sensitivity. One of the questions I typically ask is sort of how does race, wealth, and health intersect? But as much as you said, it's not kindness. It also sounds like it's not something that is specific necessarily to race, right? That radical sensitivity is something that any and everyone and all of us should be thinking about as it relates to our practices in general, kind of thinking of your original aha moment, right, Dennis, when we just think about how we're interacting with other human individuals. How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I think radical sensitivity is ultimately humane. Like it is about how are we developing humane communities, and that is not directly related to race. However, as a race scholar, I will say that there is a direct linkage to so happen differently, particularly for people of color, and more specifically for Black folks, because of anti-Blackness. And a lot of times, the experiences of not being able, particularly with Black women, I have recognized, and you both would have insights on this that I want, and so I welcome you to kind of correct the posture of what I'm saying. But there is oftentimes a belief of unending durability. And that belief of unending durability isn't just one that is impressed upon Black women and Black people by whiteness, right? It is sometimes by other Black people and other Black women. And what does that then mean? That means that we can all be in spaces where anti-Blackness is actually informing our ways that we are insensitive to the needs and the humane practices that would be able to support people even within race. So there's a lot of dynamics. Like as we were talking about, me and my mom kind of like, is this just too simple of a thing? Like, how is this something that's not? We were looking up trademarks. Some of us like, how is this something nobody else has thought of or whatever? And I think it's so simple because the complexity is all under the surface. The complexity is all in the fact that anybody can contribute to these insensitive practices that don't allow us to actually treat people humanely. And those who are most proximate to inequities need to be in humane environments more than anybody else. So that's where the race element comes in there. Because when I think about Black folks and I think about Black women, when I think about people of color more broadly, and also gender politics and things of that nature, that is where the inequities live most predominantly. And if that's the case, this may be ultimately humane, but the practices of this country in particular leads us to understand that race is hugely implicated in how we build radical sensitivity with a lens for race and culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I wasn't sure if you want to add anything, Ms. Adrienne.
No, I think Dennis hit on about to give it your little nickname.
You've actually said it twice. So
Did I
my
say
nickname is Dennis.
That was my
I
first
think I'm going to let it go. I'm going
Well, I almost stopped myself. I just add that I think race, wealth, and health, it's deeply intertwined with how it impacts the workplace. Just kind of systemic in the workplace. And just to further push what Dennis was saying, in addition to that, having a rooted place that feels like there's, belonging. I'm also a DEI officer for the organization, and that in addition, making sure things are equitable across the board in an environment where folks can feel that they don't have a voice, and where transparency is just a push word, but it's not really an action, so changing those things, going back to being proactive versus reactive in an environment, and making those terms to not just be, oh, DEI is the buzzword, or,
Right.
anything like that, just to really put them into action. And so I think that radical sensitivity in that framework, although it may seem like it could be this, it could be that, but it is all those things, because it encompasses everything in a kind of a nutshell of it.
Well, that's all for today, folks. Enjoyed the show? Be sure to like and rate the podcast. You can find the Race, Wealth, and Health podcast on multiple platforms, including Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss an episode. I also want to hear from you, so don't forget to connect with me on social media. You can follow the podcast on Instagram and Facebook at Race, Wealth, Health. By joining the online community, you'll stay updated on the latest episodes, behind-the-scenes insights, and engaging discussions. Share your thoughts, comments, and questions there. I appreciate your support in sharing the podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues who may also find value in these conversations. Thank you again for joining me on this journey. Until next time, take care, stay informed, and keep up the good fight for equality.